You're listening to Sound Money from Casey Research.
Hello and welcome to the Sound Money Show from Casey Research with me, your host, Andy Duncan. It's my great honour today to be speaking with Jim Rogers, co-founder of the Quantum Fund and most recently author of the excellent Street Smarts, Adventures on the Road and in the Markets. Today we'll be talking about China, central banks, and where the world might be headed in the next decade. Hello, Jim.
Oh, Andy, I'm delighted to be here.
Fantastic. Now, before we get to central banks, the Communist Party in China has just completed its third plenary meeting under new Premier Xi Jinping. A similar meeting occurred in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, which marked the reopening of China to the world and all that came with it. How do you think the two meetings compare in importance?
Well, it's easier to judge that when it was 35 years ago. This one we'll know in 35 years. The Chinese say it's one of the most significant 3 or 4 that they have had. We will see. We don't know all the details yet. We do know that some things are going to get a big emphasis, and I presume that's going to help us. We're getting some details. One significant, very significant thing that came out, or apparently is very significant, is they have said and stated that that the primary guiding force in China now, in their economy and in their country, will be the market. I presume they mean it because they've certainly had a lot of debate about that over the past 30, 35 years. That's in sharp contrast to the United States, by the way, where the government says, look, if there's a problem, the government will solve it. Look at Obamacare, for instance, instead of letting the markets deal with the situation and figure it out. In America, we say the government will do it. It's interesting that in China now, they say the market will be the deciding force. Some things are coming out. They've decided to modify the one-child policy again. That's getting a lot of publicity. But there are many, many other parts of the Chinese economy which will now change, and some change fairly dramatically after this meeting.
Now, when the communique said that the free market would be given a decisive role in allocating resources, they also kind of backed that up with saying the Communist Party will continue to shape the economic landscape of China. Is that a contradiction, or was that just something they had to say because they're the Communist Party?
Well, they call themselves communists, but they're among the best capitalists in the world right now and have been for a while. They've been pledging allegiance to the Communist Party ever since Deng Xiaoping said we got to try something new. Deng Xiaoping said, I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat as long as it catches mice. I think that's more or less what they're doing in China now.
Now, as you alluded to there, as China seems to be going in one direction, maybe what we might call the capitalist direction, the United States and the West in general seem to be going the other way with increased central planning. Now, Western central banks seem to have been playing in a kind of Keynesian sandpit, throwing lots of printed money at low-quality bonds, with the Fed's total assets up trillions of dollars. Banks are also storing much of this liquidity as high excess reserves, which could cause massive inflation if those excess reserves ever get out of the Fed. What's your take on this whole situation, and where are we going with it?
Well, throughout history, if people have printed staggering amounts of money, it has led to debasement of the currency and ultimately to inflation. Yeah, I suspect it's going to happen that way again this time, too. Maybe not this week, but certainly it's going to happen as we go forward. And by the way, there is inflation already, at least in most countries. Many countries acknowledge that there's inflation. India, Norway, Australia, Taiwan, China, they acknowledge that there's inflation. In America, it's only at the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that there's no inflation. I mean, everybody I know who goes to a restaurant or entertainment or just about anything, medical care, we know that there's inflation despite what the government says.
Now, a lot of this hot money is also going into not just inflation, price inflation of goods and restaurants and things, but it's going into keeping bond prices up and it's pumping up stock prices. Are both of those things in a bubble? And if so, which one do you think is going to pop first?
Oh, I would suspect the bond market would pop first. There are already indications that long-term rates have come up fairly significantly in the past several weeks. They may rally again, but I would suspect that the first of the things you mentioned, which will pop, will be the bond market. I'm not sure when it will pop, but it's certainly going to be one of the big pops of our time.
Okay. Now, in your book, Street Smarts, you used a great Frank Borman quote where you said capitalism without bankruptcy is like Christianity without hell. In a real free market, shouldn't central banks just let bad businesses and bad managers go bust to clear out all of this dead wood that's been kept alive since 2008?
No, of course, that's the way the world is supposed to work. You know, the Japanese back in the early 1990s said, we're not going to let people fail. Nobody failed, and they had a lost decade, then they had two lost decades. They were in their third lost decade when they decided to try something new. In Scandinavia, back in the early 90s, they had the same problem, but they did let people fail. A lot of people went bankrupt. It was a lot of pain, but out of that came, a reorganization, a revitalization, and Scandinavia had a great 15 or 20-year period of growth. The American way is not going to work. Refusing to let people fail, it has never worked, and it's not going to work in our case either.
Do you think then that we are going to suffer in the Western world, except Japan, we're going to suffer 2 or 3 decades of kind of just stagnation, or is some shoe going to drop somewhere and it's all going to the market should reassert itself?
Well, obviously, yes. Either one of two things is going to happen. Either some of the central banks are going to pull themselves together and say, "Hey, we've got to cut this back, and we got to be serious about it," or what I suspect is going to happen, they'll make tentative steps to cut back. The market will drop a lot, and then they'll panic because they're just government bureaucrats after all, and then they will start printing again. But eventually the market's going to say, look, we're not going to take this garbage paper anymore, and then it will end. And of course, when that happens, we're all going to have serious problems.
Now, one of the other problems with bureaucrats is that they never ever blame themselves for anything they do, and they always attempt to cover up their mistakes. What kind of cover-ups or hoaxes do you think they'll attempt over the next few years? I was thinking maybe of a kind of global fiat currency to try to absolve themselves of this economic sin.
I think that would be too complicated for the governments to put together. They might try something like that. They certainly talk about SDRs, what they call drawing rights, standard drawing rights, I guess. They might try something like that. But I'm afraid that the problems are going to be so serious that they won't have time to do something. Now, they may try it if we have a serious crisis. They may put together some kind of global currency. I don't think it will work. It's more likely that they will reach for the gold standard or a commodity-backed currency or a basket of currencies backing a currency. I suspect, though, that we're not going to have that much time when and if the crisis comes.
Now, when this crisis comes on, what it might be triggered by is that in Asia, there's a growing trend to move away from the dollar as a kind of international unit of settlement. People are starting to use the yuan and maybe even an Arab dinar and the euro and so on. Do you think, you kind of suggested there that some of these might link to gold. I suspect maybe the dinar might link to gold if the Arabs bring the dinar off. Where do you see this drop the dollar trend leading, particularly across Asia? Will they just wash their hands of the Western world or will they help the Western world recover?
Well, you already have more and more people are worrying about the dollar. The Chinese, the Russians, and other countries have said, we cannot keep going like this. After all, I'm not the only person who knows that America is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world, and that the debts are going higher and higher every day. There is a movement away from the dollar already, and that's going to continue because we do have, much as I hate to say it, we have a fundamentally flawed currency.
Now, we've heard much about China in the last few years, such as in your book, A Bull in China. Are there any other Asian countries you think could grow rapidly over the next decade, kind of riding along on the coattails of China?
Well, we certainly have Myanmar is going to be an exciting country, I suspect. North Korea, I'm very excited about. Major changes are taking place in North Korea. I would expect North and South Korea to merge in the next few years. That's going to be an extremely exciting country, a merged Korea. And those are a couple of countries. There are some of the smaller countries Cambodia's got nice, they had a horrible civil war in Cambodia for a while, but that's over now. So Cambodia's got good prospects. There are some of the countries in Asia that have marvelous prospects going forward.
Now, getting back to the West, I've been talking about it as a general lump, but each of the different countries seems to be in this kind of currency destruction, currency devaluation mode for each country to try and win a greater share of export markets. Getting more drilled down into the kind of Western world, which part of the Western world do you think is going to come off worst with this kind of currency devaluation, and which will come off least worst?
Normally, debtor nations are the ones that have the biggest problems in the end, and America is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. So I'm afraid we're going to come out of this pretty badly. The UK, the pound sterling used to be the world's reserve currency. The UK, dominated the world. Then they went deep into debt, and they had huge problems for several decades. I'm afraid that's going to happen to us in the U.S. as well.
Yeah. Well, as I live in Henley-on-Thames in the UK, that's sad news for me. Now, just to kind of end on a lighter note, some of our listeners who might be students, or some of our listeners who might have students as sons and daughters, might be trying to think of what they should do with their lives. Now, you've said perhaps people should go into agriculture and mining rather than focusing on MBAs and so on. Is there anything else people should consider before doing an MBA?
Well, no, they should only consider one thing, and that's what they love. Whatever your passions are, that's what you pursue. You should pursue. You shouldn't pursue what you hear some guy on the radio or the TV or in a magazine. You figure out your own passions and you pursue your own passions, and that's where you will be happiest. Now, if you really love finance, then sure, go into finance. I'm not optimistic about the next few decades for finance, but if you love it, go there. I went into finance when it was a backwater. Certainly wasn't a good or popular place, but I turned out okay. If you happen to love agriculture, I think agriculture is a much, much more exciting place to be going forward. But you got to do what you love, not what other people tell you.
Okay, speaking of passions, I think I've read all of your books, and my favourite has definitely been Street Smarts, your latest book. Do you have any more world adventures planned in the mode of investment biker or adventure capitalist?
Well, I may, but I'm waiting for my daughters to get older before I would do something like that. I've got two young daughters. One is 10 and one is 5. They wouldn't appreciate it if we took off seeing the world. They just wouldn't understand it. It wouldn't mean as much to them. But when they get older, I hope to do something like that again.
And is there anywhere in the world you haven't been to yet that you really want to go to?
Well, I'd like to see more of Iran, for instance. But no, for the most part, I've pretty much seen everything that I can think of. I haven't been to Israel. I'd like to go to Israel. It's another country I wouldn't mind going to. Chad comes to mind. I don't know why. I've been to many countries in Africa. I couldn't tell you much about Chad right now, but it's a name that comes to mind. But I've been many, many, many places, and I've been to many places more than once.
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to reading your book then on Chad and Iran. It's been great speaking to you today, Jim. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Let's do it again sometime.
You can subscribe to the Sound Money Show on iTunes or sign up to our podcast at Casey Research, where we'd also welcome your feedback. I'd like to thank our very special guest today, Jim Rogers, for taking the time to join us, and I'd like to thank you for listening to Sound Money Radio. If you enjoyed listening to today's show, please let your friends know all about us to help us grow this podcast. Meanwhile, and until next time, goodbye.